Have you ever been in a conversation where you wanted to sound intelligent and professional, but you felt like your vocabulary wasn't impressive enough? Maybe you were in a job interview or talking to a colleague, or even just chatting with friends, and you thought, I wish I sounded smarter right now? I totally get that feeling. Here's my confession. I used to think that sounding smart in English meant using the biggest, most complicated words I could find. I'd memorize these fancy vocabulary lists and try to squeeze words like ubiquitous and paradigm into every conversation. But you know what happened? I sounded like a walking dictionary, not like a smart person having a natural conversation. People would give me these weird looks like I was trying too hard because, honestly, I was. The truth I learned is that truly smart people don't show off with big words. They communicate clearly and effectively using the right words for the situation. They have this way of expressing complex ideas simply, and they know how to phrase things that make them sound thoughtful and intelligent without being pretentious. Today, I want to share the secrets of sounding smart in English without relying on complicated vocabulary. We'll explore natural phrases, smart ways to structure your thoughts, and techniques that native speakers use to sound articulate and impressive. By the end of this episode, you'll have practical tools to elevate your speaking and make a great impression in any conversation. Let me tell you why this approach is so much more effective than memorizing big words. When you use overly complex vocabulary, you're actually making communication harder, not easier. Smart communication is about getting your point across clearly and persuasively, not about impressing people with your dictionary knowledge. Here's the thing. Native speakers who sound genuinely intelligent don't use fancy words just to sound smart. They use precise words, thoughtful phrasing, and clear structure. They know how to make their ideas flow logically, how to give examples that make sense, and how to speak with confidence about what they know. I remember watching a TED Talk where the speaker explained incredibly complex scientific concepts using mostly simple words. She sounded brilliant. Not because she used technical jargon, but because she could make difficult ideas accessible. That's when I realized that real intelligence in communication is about clarity, not complexity. The other reason this matters is authenticity. When you use words that don't feel natural to you, people can sense it. But when you express your thoughts clearly and confidently, using language that feels genuine, people listen. They trust you more, and they're more likely to be impressed by your ideas rather than distracted by your word choices. Let me share some natural phrases that immediately make you sound more thoughtful and articulate. These aren't big words. They're smart ways to structure your thoughts. Instead of jumping straight into your opinion, try saying, "What's interesting about this is narn." This phrase shows that you've thought about the topic from different angles. For example, "What's interesting about this project is that it combines creativity with practical problem solving." It sounds so much better than just, "This project is creative and practical." Here's another phrase I love, "the way I see it." This shows that you have a perspective and you've considered the situation. Like this, "The way I see it, we have two main options here, and each has its advantages." It's simple, but it makes you sound like someone who thinks things through. You know what makes people sound really smart? Using "that said" to acknowledge different perspectives. For example, "I think this approach could work well. That said, we should also consider the potential challenges." This shows that you can think critically and see multiple sides of an issue. Let me tell you about a phrase that adds sophistication to any conversation. It's worth noting that this is perfect when you want to add an important point. Like this, "The results look promising." It's worth noting that we're still in the early stages, though. It shows you're paying attention to details and nuances. Here's one that makes you sound like you really understand a topic. What this comes down to is, use this when you want to get to the heart of an issue. For example, what this comes down to is whether we prioritize speed or quality. It shows you can cut through complexity and identify the key issue. Another smart-sounding phrase is "building on that idea." This shows you're actively listening and can develop thoughts further. Like this, "Building on that idea, we could also consider expanding to other markets." It demonstrates that you're engaged and thinking strategically. You know what phrase makes you sound incredibly thoughtful? "I'm curious about," instead of saying, "I don't understand," which can sound passive. Try, "I'm curious about how that would work in practice." It shows intellectual curiosity and engagement. Here's one that shows you can think big picture. Looking at the bigger picture. For example, looking at the bigger picture, this change could affect not just our team, but the entire department. It demonstrates strategic thinking without using complicated words. Let me share another one. What strikes me as important is this phrase shows you can identify key insights, like this. What strikes me as important is that customers are asking for simpler solutions, not more features. It sounds analytical and thoughtful. And here's a phrase that shows you understand cause and effect. The challenge here is that, for example, the challenge here is that we need to balance customer satisfaction with cost control. It shows you can identify problems and think critically about solutions. Let me tell you about my own journey with this. When I first started trying to sound more professional in English, I made so many mistakes. I remember using the word utilize instead of use in every sentence, thinking it sounded more sophisticated. But it just made me sound pretentious and unnatural. The turning point came when I started paying attention to how successful native speakers actually talked. I noticed that the most impressive speakers, whether in business meetings, interviews, or presentations, used mostly simple vocabulary. But they had this way of organizing their thoughts and phrasing their ideas that made them sound incredibly smart. I started practicing phrases like, "What's interesting about this is," and "the way I see it," in my daily conversations. At first, it felt awkward, like I was putting on an act. But gradually, these phrases became natural parts of how I express myself. People started responding differently to me. They seemed to take my opinions more seriously, and I felt more confident in professional situations. Here's what I learned. Sounding smart isn't about the individual words you use. It's about how you structure your thoughts, how you connect ideas, and how you show that you're thinking critically about what you're discussing. These phrases I've shared help you do exactly that. The other thing I discovered is that when you focus on clear communication rather than impressive vocabulary, you actually become a better thinker. These phrases force you to organize your thoughts and consider different perspectives, which makes your ideas stronger and more persuasive. Let me show you how these phrases work together in a real conversation. Imagine you're in a team meeting discussing a new project. What's interesting about this proposal is that it addresses several customer complaints we've been hearing. The way I see it, we have a real opportunity here to improve customer satisfaction while also reducing our support costs. That said, we should consider the implementation timeline carefully. It's worth noting that our team is already working on 2 other major projects right now. Building on that point, I'm curious about whether we could phase this rollout to make it more manageable. What this comes down to is finding the right balance between moving quickly and doing it right. Looking at the bigger picture, this could set us up really well for next quarter's goals. The challenge here is that we'll need to coordinate with multiple departments to make it work effectively. See how natural that sounds? The person used multiple smart phrases, but nothing sounded forced or overly complicated. They came across as thoughtful, analytical, and engaged, exactly the impression you want to make. So where can you use these techniques in real life? Let me give you some specific scenarios. In job interviews, these phrases are gold. Instead of saying, "I think I'm good at problem solving," you could say, "What's interesting about my approach to problem solving is that I always consider multiple perspectives before making decisions." The way I see it, the best solutions often come from understanding different viewpoints. In workplace discussions, try using "it's worth noting that" when you want to add important context or building on that idea, when you want to expand on someone else's point. These phrases show you're a collaborative thinker who pays attention to details. In casual conversations with friends or family, phrases like "I'm curious about" or "what strikes me as important is" can elevate your discussions without making you sound pretentious. They show you're genuinely interested in understanding different perspectives. Here's my practical tip. Start with just 1 or 2 of these phrases and practice them until they feel natural. Don't try to use all of them at once. That will sound forced. Pick the ones that feel most comfortable to you and gradually add others as these become second nature. All right, let's wrap this up. Today we explored how to sound smart in English without relying on big words. We covered thoughtful phrases like, "What's interesting about this is," "the way I see it," and "it's worth noting that." The key takeaway is that smart communication is about clarity, structure, and showing that you think critically about ideas. If you enjoyed this episode, you might want to check out episode 16, where we talked about professional phrases for work situations, or episode 20, which will help you gain confidence in conversations. Both of those episodes work perfectly with what we discussed today. Don't worry if these phrases feel awkward at first. That's totally normal. It takes time for new language patterns to feel natural, but once they do, they'll become powerful tools for expressing yourself more effectively. You're not alone in wanting to sound more articulate, and with practice, these techniques will become second nature. Remember, the goal isn't to impress people with fancy vocabulary. It's to communicate your ideas clearly and thoughtfully. When you do that, people naturally perceive you as intelligent and engaged. If you learned at least one new thing in today's episode, subscribe to our channel. It really helps us reach more English learners who want to improve their communication skills. This is Jessica, and you've been listening to the English Pro Podcast. See you in the next episode.